Hi, I'm Phil Craig.
And I'm Andrew Lownie.
And together we aim to bring you the most scandalous stories and some of the most scandalous people in history. So thanks for joining us here on the Scandal Mongers podcast.
Hello, well, big subject this week. One of the all-time greats who very rarely is part of scandal mongering.
Indeed. Actually, do you know what? I was going to, rather than starting with the normal plea for more subscriptions, which is probably making people rather tired of us, I thought it would be fun to read you a couple of reviews that have just come in on Apple. Wonderful podcast. Most intelligent exploration I've heard, says Pendulum 2 in Australia. Talking about Diana, actually, the Diana program. And this is what I like. Also from somebody interested in the royals. Princess Diana books via Apple Podcasts of Canada. We have fans all over the world. Insightful and deeply knowledgeable hosts. That's you and me, Andrew, by the way.
Gosh.
With respected guests, not your average drivel.
High class drivel.
Yeah, so we're better than average drivel. We finally made it. That was very pleasing.
Well, we got more of that to come.
Yeah, well, I don't think Geoffrey, who was our guest today, does drivel. He's a very serious man, isn't he?
Yes, he is, and he's written a serious book, which I think has been a bit ignored by some critics, because I think Churchill is such a difficult subject to criticize. But I think we both read it and we're very impressed with it.
I am actually really impressed, and I'm a bit of a Churchill fan, I must be honest. You and I have talked about 1940 more than once. But of course, the more you read of him and the diaries of the people who are close to him, there is all those cringy moments, even in 1940, even in his finest hour, where you think, crikey, someone like that would never be allowed anywhere near number 10 today. Nowhere near.
No. And the pendulum, I suppose, is swinging. I suppose when you discover also his financial affairs, which were pretty dodgy, that would have really cut him out full stop.
It does show, though, how things were sort of accepted. And I'm not just talking about some of the really unpleasant prejudices and outright racist language he would use, but also his just weird personal habits. His famously kind of lack of concern about his own body and people seeing himself half naked or fully naked, sort of wandering around in a loosely tied dressing gown, and then suddenly breaking into a kind of simulation of bayonet drill. Usually drunk.
Makes him human. Yeah, I think the fact that he was drunk, and drinking so prodigiously, does slightly sort of make you wonder whether his judgments were sensible. But I think clearly, we can talk about this with Geoffrey, but clearly his views on military strategy, we always thought he was good on that, clearly weren't very good. But, I suppose on the big questions, he got it right, or maybe this is all in hindsight.
Well, on the one very, very big question of the Second World War, he certainly did. I remember, when I was growing up in my poor, starving, working class northern background, you wouldn't understand, Andrew. We had outdoor plumbing and tin bath by the fire. Well, maybe not by the fire. But anyway, I remember all my kind of left-wing friends and relatives reminiscing about politics in the past. And whenever Churchill spoke before the Second World War, he would be met with cries of, "War about Gallipoli!" He carried the stain of that.
Really interesting, because I assume that those who worked closely with him, a bit like Mountbatten, distrusted him, but those who, in a sense, didn't know him very well, but who he spoke to because of his powers of oratory and his general persona, actually, so it was a sort of mass market appeal. But clearly there were suspicions there. We see this with the royal family too. We always imagine the Queen Mum was popular during the war, but actually that's not always the case.
Interesting. He was. If he had died in 1939, hit by a bus. In fact, I think he was almost knocked down by a car in New York, famously, when he looks the wrong way crossing the road.
In the 20s, yeah.
Oh, right. Well, he would have been remembered as a failure, as a slightly embarrassing reactionary failure who felt like he was from a different time. He took part in a cavalry charge in like 1898.
Yeah.
And I remember writing. Sorry, when I was writing. Andrew, sorry.
No, it shows you there are second acts in politics. But yeah, when you were writing.
Well, I remember writing, thinking about 1940. think of the people on the beach at Dunkirk. Their fathers, maybe even their grandfathers, would have served under Churchill decades before. You know, he was such a part of public life for so long, and so controversially changed parties multiple times, reversed his position on key issues, was generally seen as a bit of a chancer, you know, as somebody who was just not very reliable. And even when he turns up in May 1940, all the people in Number 10 are going home writing their diaries, are saying, "Oh God, you know, I'm very worried. You know, he's got all these terrible friends. Nobody trusts him. It's probably going to go awfully wrong." So.
But it's interesting. I've just been reading Chips Channon, Volume 3. This is the 1950s, and he's an old man. He's ill. There are concerns about his health, but he's still making some pretty impressive speeches and still, operating in a very sophisticated way as a parliamentary operator. So I suppose we forget also that he was this great parliamentarian, that he was a politician to his fingertips, not just a statesman.
I agree, and he was also quite political about history itself. I'm sure Geoffrey will talk about this. You know, he famously said, "I intended to be well remembered by history, for I intend to write it." You know?
Yes, indeed. Well, in some ways, that's the theme of a lot of our podcasts, the fact that we're challenging people who try to create the story. I mean, that's inevitable, I suppose. You know, you want people to remember you in a rather complimentary way.
But it's interesting, even at the time, even, you know, when he was an active politician, there was an argument about Churchill. It's not, today's generation haven't suddenly discovered that he was controversial. He was always controversial. I guess it got a certain extra twist with when the Black Lives Matter movement happened a few years ago, and people decided to start putting graffiti on his statue and really focusing on his attitudes to empire and to India and to, you know, this notion he had of racial superiority between different, not only white people and non-white people, but different types of non-white people. He had this kind of elaborate pyramid of.
Maybe we could explore that, because in some ways it's historical, but I think in some ways maybe he was even out of step with his own contemporaries on some of these issues. But almost every generation needs to rediscover Churchill. And in some ways, Geoffrey's book is not the first revisionist account. They go right back. I remember Clive Ponting, Rhodes James.
Clive Ponting, yes, the 70s, wasn't it?
Or 80s. But I mean, you know, there have been a lot of people who've challenged the myth, but in some ways I think there's a bit in the book, you know, print the legend, and that's sort of what's happened. That's what people want to read, not necessarily the truth. But we're going to give people the truth today, hopefully.
We are. Should we try and go to Geoffrey, see if we can make that interview dovetail seamlessly with our beautiful introduction? Well, welcome, Geoffrey. Thank you for joining us.
Not at all.
I really wanted to start. There's a lovely paragraph, if you don't mind me flattering you. I just want to start with a paragraph from your own book, which I hope sets the scene for the conversation we're going to have. So it's towards the end of your book, and you're trying to sum the man up, Churchill. And you have this great line, for so long a bitterly controversial figure, intensely disliked and distrusted, he was transformed at one extraordinary moment into a superhuman hero, and then gradually acquired an almost mythical status, which made it hard to distinguish fact from fiction. But for its first 40 years, his career was erratic and largely unsuccessful. His judgment as a wartime strategist was sometimes woeful. His post-war years were unsatisfactory and increasingly sad. His legacy is flawed. His posthumous influence has been little short of disastrous. So far from being a universal oracle of wisdom or virtue, few great men have been wrong so often, have made so many mistakes, or have held so many opinions and prejudices which were repugnant even at the time. Wow.
Oh dear, did I write that?
You're a brave man. Why did you write the book?
Because I was fascinated by the whole Churchill problem, or problems. I mean, for one thing, I mean, I was struck, as anybody must be, by this way that Churchill has become not only a cult figure. There is, of course, a Churchill cult. I've been abused for using that expression as I invented it. The people have been talking about the Churchill cult for 70 or 60 years. And at the end of that quotation just then, I said that all invocations of Churchill in recent times have almost unfailingly led to disaster. But in any case, I was inspired to begin with by one sentence from a great historian, Sir Michael Howard, who wrote, incidentally, he died 3 years ago. He was an esteemed friend of mine. He could just remember the rise of Hitler. He was a schoolboy in the summer of 1940. By 1943, he was a subaltern in the Coldstream Guards and won the Military Cross, leading his men at Salerno. And in the fullness of time, he became a great historian and professor of modern history at Oxford and much else besides. And he said, the problem for the historian is not, as so many Americans seem to think, why Churchill was ignored for so long, but how it was that a man with so dubious a background and so disastrous a track record could have emerged in 1940 as the saviour of his country. And that was the problem, which I'm not sure that I answered, but at least I addressed it, whereas most of Churchill's hagiographers don't even treat it as a problem. They see him as the noble hero who was almost always right, and who was a giant among pygmies, ignored until he had to be chosen in 1940.
But I mean, you're not the first revisionist historian in some ways to look at Churchill. I mean, you quote people like Rhodes James going back, many years.
50 years ago. That is perfectly true. And Rhodes James's book, which was controversial at the time, but I think wouldn't be so today, it was called Churchill 1900 to 1939, A Study in Failure. And I find that difficult to dispute. It led to a terrible falling out between Robert Rhodes James, whom I knew, and Randolph Churchill, whom I never knew, Churchill's ne'er-do-well son, who broke off relations when he realized the nature of the book that Rhodes James was researching. I think very many people would now accept that. Of course, the Churchillians do not accept it. And one in particular I have to mention at this point is Andrew Roberts. Now, I should say that he wrote a particularly violent denunciation of my book. And he has always made it clear that he regards Churchill as a giant, a genius, a saint, and a hero who was far more often right than wrong throughout his career, up until 1940. And his book takes its title from one of Churchill's more famous and exalted phrases. Churchill walking with destiny. Churchill, in his book about the Second World War, his very curious book, The Second World War, the 6 volumes, Churchill said about 10th of May 1940, when he was appointed Prime Minister, I felt as if I had been walking with destiny and that my whole life had been a preparation for this trial and this hour. And Lord Roberts, as he now is, divides his book into 2 parts, the preparation, meaning up to 1940, and the trial thereafter. But in my view, that Churchill's words don't really make sense to me. I mean, it's hard to see how his career until 1940 had been a preparation for something which was in any case completely unforeseeable. This suggests a teleological view of history, where all outcomes are predetermined beforehand, and that is not the case. Nobody knew that the war the Second World War did not have to come, and England did not have to stand alone by the summer of 1940.
Sorry to interrupt. Is there a danger that people who write about Churchill, in a sense, take off their historical hat and their ideological elements that come into it? Or is this a more recent development?
No, I think that's always been a development. I mean, he's been appropriated since his exaltation in 1940. He has been endlessly appropriated by other people who read their own political prejudices into him. They're usually on the right, and of course Churchill was, in his later years, a thoroughgoing reactionary and racist in plain language. The example he's supposed to have set in 1940, we shall never surrender, is invoked by all the wrong people for all the wrong reasons. And it has led, as I point out, to endless disasters from Suez to Vietnam to Iraq.
I'd love to ask one
Yeah.
thing, and I'm not the man to negotiate a truce between you and Andrew Roberts at all. But it's quite interesting to read the two books next to each other, because he would say, "Oh, I accept everything, the criticism, but look at this great achievement," and you might say, "Well, I accept there was this achievement, but look at all the other stuff that was terrible before and after." I mean, could it be just a quirk of history that some of Churchill's very worst qualities, the drunken belligerence, the romantic imperial bellicosity, bordering, as you say, on racism, if not outright racism, his moral slipperiness, all the really bad things that you skewer him for, could it be that those were the qualities necessary in 1940 to kind of
that's precisely what I say in the book.
Oh, right.
That all his Neville Chamberlain, in a brilliant letter in 1928, said that you don't often find yourself in the company of someone of real genius, but Winston is such a man. But he has the défauts de ses qualités, the defects of his qualities, in a French phrase. And in 1940, all those defects, which I won't repeat because you just enumerated them rather lucidly, did become qualities. Everything that was his obstinacy and pugnacity, which had been wrongly directed again and again against what he managed to be brutally pugnacious against Ulster Unionists before the Great War and Irish nationalists after the Great War, against the working class during the general strike in 1926, and of course against Indian nationalism and the foul race of Hindus, as he once called them. All of these things were wrong and objectionable, but they just came right at that particular moment. The other contradiction, incidentally, in the entire Churchillian myth is when he said in 1946, in his famous Iron Curtain speech at Fulton, Missouri, there never was a war easier to prevent than the one which has just laid waste to so much of the world and caused so much suffering. But that's a slippery argument, frankly. I mean, there is no way of proving, there's no way of disproving it, but there's no way of verifying his statement that the war could easily have been prevented. But it's very dubious, seen in historical terms. And anyway, if the war had been prevented, Churchill would never have become prime minister and never found his walk with destiny. So that's the absurd contradiction. And there was no possibility that Churchill could become prime minister until that supreme crisis.
For those who haven't read your book, I mean, what is your charge sheet when you list some of the failures?
Oh well, I mean, yeah, it's not quite a familiar one. I mean, his early days were spent as a soldier, and he wrote about the slaughter of backward peoples in various colonial wars with a zeal which we now find rather unattractive, at least I do. He was horribly wrong in his years before the Great War as a radical and an associate of Lloyd George, when along with plenty of other progressives, like the Webbs and Shaw and Wells, he was obsessed with the question of eugenics or scientific breeding, and advocated the sterilization of the socially unfit. Something which is really the supreme irony in Churchill's most ironical career. because in 1940, in a very great passage, one of his speeches, he said that if we fail, all of Europe may succumb to a new dark ages, made more terrible and prolonged by the lights of perverted science. Well, eugenics was perverted science, and we do not nowadays find anything to say in praise of those who wanted to weed out the socially inferior part of the racial stock, which was the language they used at that time. Then, of course, there was the Great War. Churchill was perceptive, as often, in seeing by the Christmas of 1914 that the Western Front had become a stalemate, where there was simply not going to be a breakthrough, and there was going to be endless, futile slaughter for years to come. That was to his credit that he saw that before most people. But the problem was that his answer, as always, was a backstairs approach or a roundabout approach, which in this case took the form of Gallipoli. And the Gallipoli landing the campaign was a disaster. He was not the only person responsible for it, but he carried the can not unreasonably, because somebody had to, and he had been very vocal in his advocacy of it, and he continued ever after to say that it had been a brilliant conception, which merely unfortunately was ill-starred and miscarried in the event. There's one answer to that is something that A.J.P. Taylor said. The Gallipoli campaign could only have succeeded if it had been fought somewhere else. But another answer is to do something that Churchill himself never did, which is go to Gallipoli. And you've only got to go there, as I've done, to see the absurdity of trying to land an army on the end of this enormous peninsula, which separates on the European side of Asia, of what was then Turkey, looking across the Hellespont towards Asia Minor. And then, had they managed to get ashore, what were they supposed to do? And even if they had reached Constantinople, as it was, and knocked Turkey out of the war, why on earth was that going to make any difference? Turkey wasn't a significant combatant. Turkey was part of the central, joined the Central Powers, Germany and Austria-Hungary, but it was, if anything, was a hindrance to them rather than a help. It made no sense whatever. Churchill was wrong about that. He was wrong about the violence after the war, which he became more and more intemperate after the Bolshevik Revolution, for one thing. And he wasn't, of course, wrong about thinking that Soviet communism was a barbarous tyranny and was likely to get worse. Although the next irony is that, having used this zealous language to denounce the horrors of the Bolsheviks, within 25 years he would be embracing Stalin as a great bosom pal, after Stalin had killed far more people than the original Bolsheviks, Lenin and Trotsky, ever did. He was intemperate in his desire to crush the IRA during the troubles of 1919 to 21. Then he created Iraq, if you want to call that an achievement, although really looking back, it doesn't seem a very satisfactory one. That is to say that among the remnants of the Ottoman Empire was a territory, part of which had been called Mesopotamia, where we fought a campaign during the Great War. And it was cobbled together from highly disparate elements, from the Kurds in the north to the Marsh Arabs in the south, but with a Shiite Muslim majority placed under Sunni rulers, a king whom the British cooked up and placed on the throne. He was one of the other people who helped create Iraq. Was Gertrude Bell, a most remarkable woman, and very knowledgeable about the Middle East. And she said at the time something which the Washington neoconservatives forgot 20 years ago. She said that if Iraq were ever to become a democracy, it would disintegrate. Then the general strike, when Churchill's language is really deplorable, and he treated the strikers, the miners who were living on starvation wages, I mean, barely enough to eat, and he wanted the general strike crushed, as indeed it was. He became Chancellor of the Exchequer in Baldwin's government in 1924, a role for which his personal finances would have shown that he was peculiarly ill-equipped, because he spent his life living on the very brink financially, and was a disastrous gambler, both in French casinos and on the stock market. And he returned.
Could I move you to India? I'm sorry, I'm just trying to rush a little bit because I'm wary of the time limits we have. But also, it's so very. You mentioned, the today we're rightly conscious of the terrible mistakes that were made, especially towards the end of the Raj. But I think you're very strong in the book about India and his lack of, his sort of almost abusive attitude and phrases about the Hindu population of that country, which is the majority, and of course that leads to the Bengal famine. I mean, which is something that's debated a lot. And I'm just reading Yasmin Khan's book about the Raj at war, and the letters that the Indian troops were fighting for the British, all over the world. They're getting letters from their communities saying we have no food.
I know it is a terrible story, and Churchill's part in it is completely indefensible, although his defenders wriggle this way and that, trying to defend him. Of course, the story of the Bengal famine was complicated. It was not simply caused by the rulers of the Raj, although the Viceroy and the Commander-in-Chief both pleaded with London for more help to relieve the famine. And to cut it short, the one man on whose deaf ears these pleas fell was the Prime Minister, Churchill. You don't have to know anything more about it, except for something that Churchill said at the time. There had been reports of another famine on a smaller scale in occupied Greece. And Churchill said, the starvation of anyway underfed Bengalis matters less than that of sturdy Greeks. He did not think black lives did not matter to Churchill.
That's
frankly,
astonishing. That is an astonishing phrase. And you also draw the parallel in the book to Holland in 1945, where they move so much to help these people who are starving, and the contrast with Bengal is shocking.
It was a contrast made at the time by Lord Wavell, who had been the commander in the desert, was removed by Churchill, became commander-in-chief in India, and then viceroy for India. And he said bitterly, you could look at the contrast between the way that famine is being relieved in Europe and how little was done in Bengal in 1943. It is not true that Churchill's views were shared by the whole of the English ruling class. That would be far too convenient. There were many members of that class who distrusted and disliked Churchill and profoundly disagreed with him on episodes like that.
And what was the reaction to your book? I mean, do you think that things have recalibrated as a result of your book and others who are challenging some of these myths, or do you think it's...
I don't know. The book has had a rather muted reaction reception in this country. Didn't get that many reviews, and they were slightly tepid, apart from Andrew Roberts's very untepid attack on it.
Well, you've got very good Amazon reviews from ordinary readers.
Well, that's very nice to know. But as it happens, among other things, I'll try not to mention another time after this, Roberts accused me he said my book was relentlessly anti-American, and it's a somewhat ironical reflection on that the book has done far better in America than it has here. it got a most appreciative anything an author could want review in the New York Times, and as well as others besides. And it's possible that one might start to impinge on the American cult of Churchill, who was, of course, invoked by everyone from Donald Trump to Rudolph Giuliani. I mean, and still is.
So there's a disconnect between, in some ways, the American establishment and, in a sense, American readers who are much more open to these myths being addressed.
Well, at least some are. I mean, I don't mean my book hasn't been bought by the entire population of the United States, alas, but it's been bought by plenty of people and apparently enjoyed by plenty of people. And it's interesting to me, at any rate, that it has been received more favorably there than here.
I'm sorry. A lot of the charge sheet I was a little bit familiar with from other books and documentaries, but the financial material, his financial arrangements, and his sometimes dubious funders, that was a real surprise to me. Do you think he was a crook, or was he just didn't care, didn't think the rules applied to him?
He didn't think the rules applied to him. I think that is definitely that's the politer way of saying it than crook. I mean, some of his dealings, I should say very briefly that fascinating material I have drawn heavily on other writers, particularly 3 books, which I can't recommend strongly enough. In order of publication, they were David Reynolds' book called In Command of History, about the way Churchill wrote or supervised the writing of the Second World War after 1945, and the colossal sums of money he made, and the way that he avoided paying any tax on his earnings at a time when everyone else in the country was paying tax as never before. Then there was Mr. Churchill's Profession by Peter Clarke, another Cambridge historian, about Churchill's life as a writer up till 45. And the most remarkable in a way is David Locke's book, that's L-O-U-G-H, like an Irish lake, called No More Champagne, which is about Churchill's professional and financial life. And he shows that Churchill his financial life was simply hair-raising. And what is more, his dealings with editors and publishers was sometimes dishonorable and sometimes barely honest.
I mean, there's some interesting parallels with Boris Johnson, the slightly
Yes,
difficult family life, the finances, saying the rules don't apply, getting, in some ways, the big questions right. I mean, you can see why Boris Johnson might identify with him.
Well, of course, Boris Johnson identifies with him, but I don't think the rest of us are obliged to identify Mr. Johnson with Churchill. I mean, if ever there was, I mean, Marx's famous phrase about history repeating itself, the first time as tragedy, the second time as farce, was inspired by the contrast between the great Napoleon and his nephew, Louis Bonaparte, who seized power in France in 1849 and then proclaimed himself emperor. And you know, the first Napoleon was a giant. Napoleon III was a joke. And you could apply those words, I think, to Sir Winston Churchill and Boris Alexander Professional Johnson.
Well, it's slightly off the point, but I guess you could say that in a career where he makes lots of mistakes and scandals, he gets one big foreign policy thing right. I would give Johnson Ukraine, which is very Churchillian. He goes against quite a lot of the advice and what the European leaders are doing and does something rather bold. Well, you may not agree, but I would probably say that.
Well, I know that many people do think that, although I find the way that Johnson in particular, among other Western politicians, has been waving the bloody shirt of Ukraine and is anxious to fight to the last Ukrainian, not entirely admirable. I mean, I can see that we don't know. We don't know.
We don't. And
you have a very good section at the end reviewing the books on Churchill, and I think you make the point that the best books that have been written, like David Locke's, are looking at very specific areas of his life. And that's where the new research, I mean, new things are still being said about him, but by focusing on certain areas. Would you say that that's the sort of future now of books about Churchill rather than the
Well,
big
yeah,
picture?
yes, it is. I mean, I think it was Peter Clarke, who I mentioned a moment ago, who pointed out in a piece the other week that there are now more than 60 books in the library catalogues with titles beginning Churchill and India, Churchill and Lloyd George, Churchill and America, whatever. And on it goes. All of these books, not all of them, but some of them are really excellent and very valuable. What nobody, in my view, has yet written is a definitive biography of Churchill. On the scale it deserves to be written, and with the detachment that is required, but very few people seem to be able to achieve. I don't consider my own book isn't a life of Churchill anyway, and it is not intended to be a work of scholarly detachment.
But it's interesting, and one of the reviews says, Andrew Roberts is the best one-volume history, which is pro-Churchill, and yours is the best one-volume history, which is perhaps more critical. So in some ways, maybe they can never be definitive.
That was the New York Times. It said that mine was the best one-volume indictment of Churchill. My reaction to that was pensive. Authors who complain about unfavorable reviews are bad enough, but for an author to complain about a favorable review would be intolerable. So I was very pleased.
I would no way would I call your book a hatchet job. Actually, I really wouldn't.
I'm very glad you say that.
You bend over backwards to be nice to him when you think he merits it. I think
some people have said that.
Yes,
that New Yorker review, which called
it's funny. It's like the painting, isn't it?
Yeah.
You know the story of the painting. I think you're right about it. Is it Sutherland that is commissioned to do a picture, and he goes for the warts and all portrait, and he paints his picture, and Churchill burns it.
Well, Churchill didn't burn it; his wife did.
His wife burnt it.
But you talk of it being an alternative, and I think that's rather than revisionist. I think you're very keen to stress right from the very beginning that this is just another way of looking at Churchill.
Well, of course it is, and the last thing I would remotely pretend to be is writing any kind of detached story. I've chosen to look at Churchill in one way, but I am pleased that you say it's not a hatchet job. Only one or two other people. One was Rupert Christensen, who's a distinguished writer himself, a ballet and opera critic, who's written a number of very good books on 19th century Paris, for example. And he said, unfortunately, on Twitter rather than in a book review, that he said something very flattering about my Geoffrey Wheatcroft's reassessment of Churchill. And please note, it is a reassessment rather than a demolition job. And a reassessment was my intention. I never set out to write an indictment or demolition job at all, but I was trying to puzzle away at the things we've discussed already.
Because also you're in a long tradition, as I say, going back to Rhodes James and earlier, and Richard Toye, for example. And I mean, there's been a recent book, Bill Schwartz's The Churchill Myth. So, I mean, you're not alone here if you feel slightly isolated.
No, I know I'm not. I sometimes, anybody who writes about Churchill might or certainly ought to pause for a moment and ask himself, do we need another book on Churchill? But I was just so fascinated by the subject, I had to write the book and get it off my chest.
Well, I'm very glad you wrote it, and I'm very glad you joined us today. We are pretty much out of time, but I would urge anybody to read this book. Even if you're a passionate Churchill fan, you'll learn loads of things about him. And you'll also have some of the things you think you know about him challenged, which is what a great book is, isn't it?
Well, I'm very pleased that you say that, and thank you so much.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to talk to you.
Very good.
Well, yeah, fascinating discussion. I mean, we sort of ran out of time. I mean, he could have had a couple of hours on the charge sheet there.
I think maybe we should get Andrew Roberts to do one. Perhaps they'd debate on our podcast. What do you think?
Yes. Well, I think the thing is, I think it's very hard to change people's point of view, and everyone's going to select the material that supports their argument. And a lot of it is, as you said, emphasis. It depends what you think's important. So yeah, I don't know how fruitful that would be. I mean, I think it's a shame because I think they're both very good historians who have made very strong arguments, and it's that's one of the joys of history, that there's no one answer.
I think in Geoffrey's book, the only bit I would probably think was a bit far was in the way he tries to refer everything in the last 20 years to Churchill, the Iraq War and things like that. I mean, of course, Churchill, had a huge influence on the way people thought, and everything was interpreted in terms of, a Munich appeasement and we must fight dictators.
Well,
but I don't know. It's very.
My reading of that was that the people, have adopted, Churchill to support their arguments, whether it's Brexit or the United States of Europe, whatever it is. And I think that's inevitable with someone who's so complex and will have made lots of contradictory remarks, and also is operating in another context, another era. So, no, I thought it was rather interesting the way that people had hijacked them for their own political cause. And I think there is a danger that people who do write about Churchill do so not as completely independent, but as people who've got an agenda and use him to support that agenda. And that's not true just of the politicians, but I think some of the historians as well. And I'm not sure that's what historians should be doing.
Interesting.
And that raises wider issues about, historians and politics and how far they should keep their hands clean.
I mean, our culture war today, the fashionable phrase for it, is further sort of heightened by the way people get so angry instantly with each other on social media, which of course didn't used to be like that. So you have to take a side. I think we talked about this in our very first introduction show, that actually there's less meeting of minds. I remember being taught at university in the late 70s, early 80s by, a very conservative historian, David Cannadine, and a very radical left-wing historian, Vic Gattrell. But they would kind of like talk and quite enjoy the different interpretations they would have, say, of the British Empire. And it didn't seem as nasty. Maybe it was. I don't know. What do you think?
No, I don't think it was. I think, and let's hope we can get back to tolerance and respecting other people's point of view. Because, everyone sees things in a slightly different light. And I think part of history is about trying to persuade people to follow your view, but not necessarily to disparage it. But yeah, I think one of the great things about reading history is it does open your mind to other points of view and other ways of looking at things. I mean, if you just think of how the history tripos at Cambridge has changed since we were there 40 years ago, it's a much, much more open, ironically, it's a much wider syllabus, and yet in some ways, as you say, people have more entrenched views.
And I think, that's why it's so unfair, I think, to call Geoffrey's work a hatchet job. What he does is he makes you look at the bits that in the past you probably just cringed at, like the racist language. It's always been there in some of these documents. People have chosen not to focus on it, and they said to themselves, oh, well, that was a man of his time and that's how people were. But, it was wrong then and it's wrong now. And I think it's absolutely right that he should look and dig into those difficult and embarrassing areas of his subject's life.
Absolutely. And it's very much what I've tried to do with my books. I mean, everyone with Mountbatten was saying these are rumors about his bisexuality, his paedophilia, and dismissed it, that this was just gossip. And yet now, not even just with my book, but since, there's even pieces in the paper today about policemen coming forward saying a member of the royal family was investigated in the 1970s for paedophilia. Again, with Edward VIII, people said, well, he wasn't a Nazi stooge. And now again, it's been recalibrated.
Yes.
So I think people do ignore things. I think I actually represented David Locke's book on his finances, and it's absolutely damning, how he was fiddling the tax system and, taking money from people when he didn't need it. Dishonest behavior, frankly. And he would have been drummed out of Parliament if he'd been open. At least we also have there's more transparency now. There's more scrutiny of our politicians, less deference, and I think he benefited from that. He was able to get away with it in a way Boris Johnson hasn't been able to.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with that. And think of some of the other shows we've done, like the Profumo show. This is a time where if you're in the charm circle, you could get away with so much misbehavior or even quasi illegal activity, both financial and sexual. But if you are not in the charm circle, you had no power, nobody would look out for you, and you could be crushed like a bug. So yeah, I'd definitely rather live in this world. Oh God.
Yeah, and then it's accepting. One of the interesting things about the Lord Lucan show was, that everyone assumed he behaved a certain way. He wasn't actually protected as might have expected as a member of the establishment, and in fact, he suffered, under a prejudice. So I suppose history is more complicated than one imagines.
Well, having agreed with each other that all our shows are fascinating, let's hope people keep watching and listening to them. And the next time we talk, by the way, the next time we talk, I will be on the other side of the world.
That's exciting. Yes, well, there are not many podcasts that have come to you from two different parts of the world.
Well, without giving too much away, I think one of our upcoming shows is going to be me in Australia, you in London, and Katja Hoyer in Berlin.
Yes. International. This is an international show.
Yes.
So, that's a very varied program coming up. So I hope people will tune in, subscribe, and let us continue to bring all these wonderful guests.
Thank you. Well, let's do that. See you soon.
See you soon. Good trip. Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Scandal Mongers podcast. This has been a Podcast World production. You can get in contact with our show by emailing team@podcastworld.org, placing Scandal Mongers in the heading, or via our social media links within the show's bio.